Hello, everyone, and welcome to If You've Got Time to Lean. I'm Linda Jacobson, and I will be moderating this session with Todd Smith. Please remember to remain muted to minimize background noise. The session will be recorded and live captioning is enabled. If you don't want to see these captions, you may choose Hide Subtitle on the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. You may place your questions in chat. We will do our best to address as many as we can after the presentation. If you want to submit anonymously, you may submit to Todd in a private chat. I'll now turn over the session over to our presenters, Juanita Thacker and Suzanne Sawyer.
All right, thank you for that, Linda. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our session. If you have time to lean, rethinking productivity. We want to thank you for attending today, and we hope that we'll leave you with some good food for thought, as well as some other valuable takeaways. In the chat, you will find a link to a folder with a presentation inside of it and some other notes if you would like to follow along that way. My colleague, Suzanne Sawyer, has dropped that into the chat for you. All right, and as mentioned, my name is Juanita Thacker, and I am the Information Literacy Librarian here at UNCG Greensboro at the University Libraries. I have she, her pronouns, and this is my colleague, Suzanne Sawyer, also with she, her pronouns, and she is the Preservation and Manuscript Specialist here at UNCG Libraries. All right, before we begin, we want to acknowledge that the land that we, the presenters, are gathered on has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst a number of indigenous peoples, specifically the Kauai and the Saura, who respect and honor the diverse indigenous peoples connected to this territory and stand with them to resist erasure of indigenous histories. We're also cognizant that we cannot separate the history of our university or our community from the history of colonialism and slavery in the United States. We want to acknowledge the free people forcibly kidnapped from Africa in order to be enslaved on these lands. I want to acknowledge my own Black ancestors as being victims of this trauma. This legacy persists today as we continue to work towards racial justice, equity, liberation, and community here in Greensboro, North Carolina. So today's agenda. So what we have on deck for you today is we have a brief historical survey of policies, practices, and expectations surrounding the traditional workplace. We'll outline some challenges, particularly some of the effects of legacy practices on employees and supervisors' perceptions of productivity. We will offer some practical ideas for how we might disrupt the status quo. And we will close with questions and group discussion. So If You've Got Time to Lean came about due to Suzanne and I's shared work histories, as well as our poorly communicated and inequitable ways in which many of us working in libraries were mandated to return to work during this pandemic. The aforementioned shared work experience being that both of our first jobs as teenagers was at the local McDonald's. So we both remember how utterly unacceptable it was for you not to be working every moment of your shift, every second of your shift. Standing idle to take a moment to rest or even think was almost foreboding. And that's where, of course, we heard the old adage, if you have time to lean, you've got time to clean, more than a few times while we were working there. I can recall quite clearly at 17 years of age being trained when at the lunch rush hit and my trainer had to stop and just stop everything he was doing and help deal with the onslaught of hungry customers. I didn't know what to do, so I just stood there. A store manager saw me standing there and promptly told me to do something, to which I replied, I don't know how to do anything. And he told me to grab a towel and to begin wiping. So that was a really eye-opening and slightly jarring experience for 17-year-old Juanita. And to be quite frank, it did leave kind of a bad taste in my mouth because I really felt like I wasn't being compensated well. I mean, I wasn't the smartest 17-year-old, but I do recognize that $5.75 an hour is not a living wage now or in 1996. And I was annoyed that my youthful inexperience was not recognized. Of course, my only context dealing with adults at that time being in school. So those kind of early job experiences certainly have a tendency to make us sometimes feel expendable and exploited. And so that's what kind of brings us here today. the traditional workplace. We've always done it this way. So I'm sure many of you have heard this from many of your colleagues, sometimes supervisors, bosses, coworkers, who are, the type who are more resistant to change. So I thought that would be a good quote to include here. And of course, we're all familiar with these traditional workplace like expectations. I realize that many folks working in libraries and other industries may work varied schedules and alternative schedules. I actually was one of them, as I have a long history working in access services and libraries before I completed my degree. But for the services of this presentation, we're going to focus on the traditional workplace kind of time management practices. So we all know that that's 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, which is a traditional 40-hour a week work schedule, mandatory 30-minute or 1 hour break off the clock. And often many of us are not working remotely. Obviously, work is tied to a physical location. And as you can see, this timeline shows the evolution of the American work week, including a few major events that explain how we got to our 40-hour work weeks. So this labor practice grew out of agriculture. I'm sorry. In the 19th century, American laborers worked from sunup to sundown 6 days a week. And that's a practice that we got, of course, from agricultural work prior to major industrialization. However, during the height of the Industrial Revolution, the shorter hours movement began. We can see the result was a reduction of hours in the 1880s to 60 hours a week, which is better, but far from ideal. After many attempts from 8-hour-a-day labor advocates and organizations in industrial cities to get some laws passed to change and reduce the number of daily work hours, the AFL, or the American Federation of Labor Union, took action. They targeted certain trades and unions, threatening them with protests if they did not fall in line with the 8-hour-a-day movement. By the time the 1920s rolled around, Henry Ford had decided to decrease his company's hours to 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. Some other prominent figures had marginal success in reducing work hours, but the work week did not decrease to 40 hours a week until the Great Depression of the 30s. During that time, the hours dropped to roughly 30 hours a week, of course, because of economic hardship. However, later on in the decade, closer to the 40s, during World War II, the reemergence of the 40-hour work week as the economy began to rebound began to take shape, and we have federal laws passed to enact it. As you can see, the Fair Labor Standards Act codified the 40-hour work week to Americans or in America. Just going to take it back for a second here. Something else began to happen in the late 19th century as these labor movements were growing and these changes were taking place. Management began to research how the number of hours worked affected productivity. And it was found that productivity gains dropped off at around 48 hours a week. So there are some critics of Henry Ford who point to this, having this knowledge as his true motive from behind enacting the shorter work week. And it was also in part due to the fact that he wanted to maintain operation of his production plants 24/7. So breaking the 24-hour day up into 8-hour shifts, right? So no surprise, it seems like his motives, of course, were not at all altruistic. Defining productivity. So speaking of productivity, we'll look at this definition by management consultant Ellie Koss and operations management professor David Lewis. Productivity is the state of bringing forth, of generating, of causing to exist, of yielding large results or yielding abundantly. So this definition, of course, is pretty standard, put into the context of the library workplace of the 21st century. What exactly does that mean? If anything, this pandemic has taught us, many of us, it's how dependent the field is of librarianship is upon technology. We not only use it to provide accessible resources to our users and collaborate on various projects with our colleagues, but also to monitor and record the amount of time spent working. Whether it's Google Suite, Zoom, Trello, banner timekeeping, the COVID pandemic forced many libraries and higher education institutions to do away with the old and adapt to the new. That ultimately meant replacing obsolete workflows with ones that facilitated safe access to our patrons by leveraging these various technological tools. That being said, as return to work messaging and guidance was being propagated throughout the UNC system and other institutions back in the summer of 2020, I believe, a problematic narrative began to take shape. We were told in one form or another that remote work would no longer be encouraged and everyone was expected to return on site. The undertone of that message, for those of us who really enjoyed the benefits of a hybrid work schedule, was that we were not being productive unless we were being observed physically on site. I found that to be extremely insulting as a former distance education student. I completed the vast majority of my undergraduate and graduate degrees almost exclusively online, but also as a hardworking state employee of over a decade. It also triggered some of those latent, very unpleasant feelings and memories about how I was treated when I worked at McDonald's. Productivity is not something that occurs only in physical environments, and the ability of our institutions to rise to the occasion by continuing to provide instruction to our respective student population, proves this. The notion that my productivity can be distilled down to something as basic as physical presence, given all the technology now at our disposal, is outdated at best and disingenuous at worst. Given this, you may be asking yourself, where does this ossified interpretation of productivity come from? Well, we're going to take a look at that right now. Associate U.S. History professor at UC Berkeley, Caitlin Rosenthal, contends that Southern slave owners had a profound influence on the management practices that are here with us today. In fact, the article states that, and I quote, Southern plantation owners kept complex and meticulous records, measuring the productivity of their slaves and carefully monitoring their profits, often using even more sophisticated methods than manufacturing industries in the North. The article continues, the rise of slavery in the Caribbean marked the beginnings of a separation between ownership and management, as plantations owners were not present, leaving the operation of their plantations in the hands of others. Under this new arrangement, owners could collect information about how long slaves ate. They could move them around in an effort to maximize their productivity, how long they fed their children. And of course, manual laborers in the North who were working under similar conditions could quit, but obviously slaves did not have that option. The underlying message behind the phrase, if you've got time to lean, you've got time to clean, is that you are being monitored every second of the day, that you're on the clock, just as slaves were on the plantation. Capitalism is inherently exploitative, and having worked a handful of service industry jobs, I can tell you that many of them are rife with toxic behaviors that fuel it. Those of us working in academia, particularly those in leadership roles, should ask ourselves if these are the kind of values and practices that we want to replicate on our campuses and on our institutions. And to that end, to answer that question, I actually have a link that Suzanne will drop in the chat that includes some management practices that I found on the state human resources page policy. If you want to follow along, it's under section 4, under the hours work section. It was most recently revised in 2017. It states, and I'll go slow here because it's very wonky policy, kind of jargon heavy language, so it's not the easiest to understand. So, all time during which an employee is required, suffered, or permitted to be on the employer's premises, on duty, or at a prescribed workplace, except for meals and other periods when the employee is free from duty, is considered as hours worked. This is so even if the duties are pleasurable rather than burdensome, even if no productive work is actually being performed. The policy continues, all time which an employee is required to be on duty on the employer's premises or at a prescribed workplace, and all time during which an employee is suffered or permitted, whether or not they are required to do so. So based on this policy, simply being on site for a period of time is like deemed to be productive to the state of North Carolina. So I'm sure many of our colleagues and supervisors maybe agree with that, some disagree, but Suzanne and I would like to know what you all think. So I have a Minty meter here. I would like you all to, Suzanne dropped the information in the chat, but I would like everyone to answer this Mentimeter question. Let's see. Oh, there it is. All right. I'll give you a few minutes for that while I get my technical side on this going. So can traditional measures of productivity be applied in our modern workplaces? If so, are they still appropriate? Feel free to unmute, drop in the chat for your responses. I'll give you a few minutes to think about that question. 2:31, I'll give you 2 minutes. All right, so here the responses are coming in. We'll make this bigger for everyone here. So no, a 40-hour work week assumes a traditional family with one parent working and the other parent home with the kid housekeeping. I agree. The 40-hour work week doesn't really take into account, I think the 40 hours, particularly on-site work week, does not take into account that there are now a myriad of different family structures that people have. I have never believed that the library is a place for quotas. Also, that's great commentary, and I agree. Our leaders seem to think that they can. I've had similar experiences where it's been stated or implied that working anywhere other than my office is not really working at all. Yeah, that's certainly been familiar at various libraries that I've been employed with as well. In some cases, there are quantitative measures that make sense. Often, though, we're doing relationship building work that is by its nature productive, but is not productive, but it's critical to a healthy organization. I agree. I actually think that, maybe we can, Suzanne will have some ideas about how we can change the narrative around what, relationship building I actually think is productive. Employees should be compensated at any time they're required to be at work, but that time spent isn't inherently valuable to the organization. I agree. Prioritizing time spent and presence over value added is outdated and demoralizing to employees. That is on the money. I totally agree with that sentiment. And of course, I think all of us have had times when we were on site and for whatever reason, we really weren't as productive as we normally are that day. It just didn't happen for whatever reason. It depends on the work. For many, no, the nature of the work has changed and we work in different ways now. I agree. Yeah. I'm much more productive when I have the flexibility to take care of myself and my mother as necessary. I totally agree with that sentiment. That's something I relate to personally as well as someone who is caring for elderly parents or parents now. I read a comment recently that if I learned how to do a task in 30 minutes that takes someone else an hour, you're paying me for that experience, but not for 30 minutes of time. Wow. All right. Yeah. I love that way of looking at productivity. That's very cool. Interesting. I think when it all boils down to it, we need to be redefining what productivity is. I totally agree. We're not producing widgets on the money. We're developing relationships with ourselves and our communities. Exactly. So these are some really, 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 really great responses. I'm actually probably going to keep this. These are really, really great responses. I appreciate your help on that. So I will get out of this. And I will now pass it on to my colleague who will discuss challenges and impacts. So welcome, Suzanne.
Thanks, Juanita. So Juanita provided an overview of what the traditional workplace practices are and how they developed. And now we're going to take a look at the impacts of those practices, both on employers and employees. Next slide. Journalist Brittany Wong Journalist Brittany Wong wrote, "Relentlessly working in times of uncertainty is about as American as apple pie. Work culture in the United States valorizes the grind, and in moments of crisis, we grind all the harder," unquote. So let's face it, Americans had a problem with toxic productivity and hustle culture, as HuffPost reporter Monica Torres put it, long before COVID-19 came along. But the pandemic has caused us to sort of double down on that grind. Next slide. There we go. So following are just a few of the impacts that we've identified. And before I begin, I want to interject that both Juanita and I are very fortunate to have great supervisors who have been incredibly supportive of us both personally and professionally. So a huge shout out to Kathleen Smith and Jenny Dale if you're here. None of the following is about our current supervisors or really any specific supervisor. Rather, these are observations over time from experiences at several different institutions. So of those impacts on us, number one, toxic productivity and burnout. Psychologist Catherine Esker reported, being productive in our immediate environment takes our minds off things and feels good, at least temporarily. In general, when our environment presents us with stressors or threats that are well beyond our control, often we find ourselves focusing on small things within our immediate environment in which we can control, such as cleaning our house or excelling on work projects. The problem is it masks the true stress and discomfort of our current situation, unquote. Hustle culture has created an environment where we don't know how to shut off and unplug, or we feel guilty if we do manage to step away for brief periods of time. And there's a limit to how long we can maintain that pace of toxic productivity without consequences to our health and happiness. Number two, micromanaging and lack of trust. Just as we saw folks feeling the need to declutter their closets at home or learn to bake bread in order to gain control of their lives, there were many folks who carried that need to control things or regain power to work with them. For some, this meant the development of negative managerial habits, such as micromanaging and rigidity. We've always done it this way. It manifested as lack of trust in employees to do their jobs. Work from home logs were created and timesheets were scrutinized, as some employers had difficulty believing their employees were working when they weren't in the office. The result created a culture in which some employees felt like they were being watched all the time. For an example of this, I recently ran into a colleague as I was walking to the parking deck. I said, "Hi, how are you?" And their answer was, "I'm leaving early because I have to teach late tomorrow night." First of all, I wouldn't have known what my colleague's schedule was on any given day. And second, I'm not keeping track of the coming and going of my colleagues, yet somehow this colleague was concerned that I wouldn't think they were working as they should be. And it was the last thing on my mind. And it also made me kind of sad that that was their first thought. Number three, overcommitment to fairness instead of equity. Despite discovering many new innovative ways to do our work remotely, that privilege was not extended to everyone equitably. Aside from external situations such as child or elder care, there was not always an adequate consideration of physical and emotional needs of all employees. Frontline workers, both in libraries and everywhere else, were not always afforded the same flexibility. Sometimes, even when flexibility could have been granted to some, it wasn't because it might not be fair. Staff often hear this as an excuse for managers about anything from space allotment to salary raises. I can't because it isn't fair. Number four, low morale and failure to thrive. If you're unfamiliar, Juanita and I wholeheartedly recommend the work of Katrina Davis Kendrick on low morale in librarianship. Kendrick wrote, quote, affective responses to low morale include classic grief and disillusion with academia and librarianship, upticks in stress and anxiety, development of new chronic conditions or exacerbations of existing conditions, a development of work dread, reduced professional confidence, an increased mistrust of colleagues or leadership, and demoralized academic librarians experience depression and related conditions, including PTSD, unquote. With low morale, we might make it to work most days, but we're no longer thriving, we're just surviving. So then I have a question for you before I talk about presenteeism. And this is a question for the audience. If you want to put your answer in the chat, you can, but you don't have to. Have you ever come to work while unwell mentally or physically? If you feel comfortable, you can put your answer in the chat. Okay, if so, why did you decide to come to work even when you were unwell? if you feel comfortable saying so. Why did you decide to come to work even when you were unwell? Desk schedule, chronic illness, feeling guilty like I had to be there. If we aren't seen at work, there may be an assumption by some supervisors that work wasn't or isn't happening, and this breeds presenteeism or the need to come to work at all costs to prove we're working. But as we've experienced, not everyone sitting at a desk is working or working efficiently, and not everyone at home is loafing. Look at all those answers. Desk schedule, didn't want someone else to have to cover my work, felt guilty leaving colleagues, low income and couldn't afford to have those hours unpaid. Felt like I had obligations that couldn't be postponed. Colleagues would suffer if I didn't come. So there's a lot of these that are talking about stress or guilt. Needed a minimum number of bodies on site to keep the place open, and there's a very small staff. The stress of undone work led me to believe I would feel worse not working. Absolutely. Next slide. All of that was presenteeism, that need to prove that we're working and we don't want to leave that load on someone else. Hyper focus on product or process versus overall outcome. So consider the difference between quantity and quality of teaching sessions or reference encounters. Good statistics don't equate with a job well done, yet some supervisors are focused on these quantitative measures. Not to mention that the pressure from some supervisors to maintain pre-pandemic productivity statistics has compounded the mental and emotional impact of the pandemic. Likewise, some supervisors are focused more on process than outcome. Do I see you working? If I don't know what you're doing, how do I know you're progressing? Admittedly, this sort of focus on product or process is often more prevalent among supervisors of staff rather than faculty. If a supervisor doesn't know what an employee is up to, then that's an indication that there's a communication breakdown, not necessarily an indication that work isn't being completed. Number 7, mission creep. So back to that concept of if you've got time to lean, you've got time to clean. With the grand disruption that was the pandemic, what we had before us was an opportunity to reevaluate everything. What work are we doing? How are we doing it? And why are we doing it? Does it still reflect what we've identified as our stated values and mission? Co-founders of the Institute for Habits of Mind, Arthur Costa and Ben Akalik, wrote, quote, "Developing habits of continual growth and improvement requires self-reflection. As we as individuals, staffs, and organizations reflect on our actions, we gain important information about the efficacy of our thinking. These experiences let us practice the habit of continual growth through reflection," unquote. Without that time for reflection, we run the risk of mission creep or doing work that really isn't aligned with our overall goals and values. Number 8, stifling innovation in favor of the status quo. We sometimes forget to look for evidence in the data rather than making assumptions based on past experience. After the pandemic shut down, some managers perceived a pressure to return to, quote, normality without evidence that the needs of students were going unmet. There was a false urgency to be in the building rather than focusing on the safety of staff, especially frontline workers. And we know that library employees are overwhelmingly white, though the percentage of employees of color is often higher among frontline workers. Frontline work is by nature the least flexible of the jobs in a library, and the people with the least amount of power end up facilitating the flexibility for the rest of the folks in the library. Surely there were other options, but we didn't consider them because that wasn't in line with our preconceived notions of how student needs could be met. 9, lack of retention of good people. Christine Romaines of CNN Business reported that the Great Resignation isn't about finding ways for people to live without income. Instead, it's about folks leaving underpaid jobs or toxic work cultures to work in jobs with a livable wage and workplaces that are flexible, unquote. Employees have other options, and we risk losing people due to toxic workplace policies and practices. We're specifically contributing to the problem of retaining Black, Indigenous, and people of color employees in a profession that remains around 85% white. As Amy Van Scoy and Kawana Bright cover in their article, articulating the experience of uniqueness and difference for librarians of color, aside from all of the above contributing factors that we've mentioned, BIPOC employees are likely also experiencing microaggressions, tokenism or serving on all diversity-related committees and service initiatives, and uniqueness, being the only one or the one of only a few employees of color, as well as comprising such a small percentage of those in the library profession overall. So it's even harder for them to have their concerns heard and addressed. Next slide. In an effort to advance a paradigm shift in management practices and toxic productivity standards in libraries, we offer the following practical solutions. It should be noted that our ideas are not at all unique, and rather they draw on the best practices of management from various different industries, such as in business or education, as well as in libraries. Our goal here was to gather these into a resource that can be used by library administrators and managers as a guide for rethinking productivity and what actually fosters healthy productivity, maintains a positive work culture, and creates equity in their libraries. We'll also offer some suggestions for individuals about how to disrupt toxic productivity. Next slide, please. Our very survival depends on our ability to stay awake, to adjust to new ideas, to remain vigilant, and to face the challenge of change. Martin Luther King Jr. So change is possible, but it's going to require action on the part of both employers and employees. Next slide. So following are some solutions for employers, managers, administrators. Flexible schedules and reason-neutral work from home policies work better for everyone. Joan Williams and Marion Multhop, creator of the Center of Work Life at UC Hastings, wrote, "With a little bit of communication, offices can allow everyone to adjust their hours to fit their employees' strengths, schedules, and accommodate their lives. We manage to work around interruptions and schedule changes all the time, so why not build that flexibility in from the start? Also, what does it look like to create that same flexibility for employees, including frontline staff? I suspect frontline staff are probably our best resource for answering that question. Flexibility shouldn't just be for some employees. Likewise, work from home policies should be reason neutral and available to everyone. Employees should not have to explain their reason for working from home. If they do, the manager's put in the position of deciding which reasons are acceptable and which aren't, and that's never good. The exception here, of course, is if employees need to be in the office for some reason, or if they aren't meeting deadlines while working from home. Number 2, don't let supportive policies die in the employee handbook. Part of creating a better culture is to encourage employees to take advantage of supportive policies, such as paid leave for vacation or bereavement. And this is a do as I do proposition. Administrators need to model self-care if we're going to shift the culture around taking time off when needed. 3, know the difference between equity and fairness or equality. Equity recognizes each person has a different circumstance and needs, and therefore different groups of people need different resources and opportunities allocated to them in order to thrive. Equality is giving everyone the exact same resources across the board, regardless of individuals or groups of people's actual needs or opportunities or resources already provided to them. If employees are reporting, quote, unfairness, then supervisors need to work on organizational culture as well as policy. Are employees actually reporting unfairness? And if so, what are the complaining employees actually in need of? Chances are there are deeper issues there than wanting to have an equal schedule to someone else. Perhaps it's more to do with being seen and appreciated for their contributions or supporting them when they need time off, regardless of the reason. Number 4, and I'm speeding up because I know we're getting close on time. Establish trust with your employees and then trust them. One of the easiest ways for a comfortable workplace to become toxic is if there becomes a culture of trying to trap people in lies, checking up on people unexpectedly, or generally not trusting each other. There needs to be trust established between managers and employees and coworkers for a workplace to function. If you feel like you can't trust your employees to work out of your site, that's a performance problem and needs to be treated like one. Next slide, please. Set clear boundaries and procedures for communications. Make sure everybody knows the rules. And for example, if your hours differ from your employees' hours, remind them that they're not responsible for responding to your messages outside of their regular hours. Measure outcomes and not process. Save your scrutiny for employees' outcomes, not their whereabouts. This will help avoid toxic climates and will redirect employees' energy away from looking busy and feeling anxious towards doing their actual job. Plan, provide, and protect time for self-reflection. If you've got time to lean, you've got time to self-reflect, decompress, and better align your productivity with the values and goals of the organization. And finally, promote collaborative dialogues between employer and employee, as well as employee and employee. Whether a formal meeting or a walk to get coffee or tea, build in time to talk to employees and both provide and receive feedback, not just once a year or at the annual review. And likewise, encourage that among employees. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to skip over this part because we're running late. So solutions for individuals, and I'm going to just let you know we're going to have a link to our slides after this, and all of the presenter notes. What I would have said would be in will be in that folder as well. It isn't in there yet, so if you click the link at the beginning, you won't get to that. But these are some of our solutions for individuals. I'll say really quickly that most of these suggestions came from a great article titled "The Comprehensive Guide to Resisting Overcommitment: Reclaim Your Agency in the Workplace" by Katrina Spencer. And it's a great article, and I just want to direct your attention to that. Our references are at the end. All of these suggestions are in there. So let me just read through the list quickly though. Recognize the signs of overcommitment. Stay on mission with regular self-auditing, know your capacity and set boundaries, determine whose standard you're trying to meet, create buffers in your schedule, pause and scrutinize before committing, consider participating without taking ownership or leading, unplug and don't make apologies about it, and ensure that your work leaves room for your personal life. So I apologize that I had to compress that. I will put these notes in our presentation folder, and you can access all of this information later. And now we'd like to just turn it over to you. If you have questions or if there's anything that we've talked about that you would like to discuss, please let us know. And also, I will note that our contact information is on, I think, the next slide. Is that right? Yeah. So if you have questions and want to get in touch with us, this is how you can get in touch with us. And while I'm waiting, I will put a copy of my presenter notes in the folder.
And actually, I am going to, I noticed that my email is not correct.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. It's JMTHACK, JMTHACK 3 at uscg.edu. I will drop that actually in the chat. I don't know how that popped in there. That's funny. We're gonna blame that on daylight savings time.
Any questions for us? Thanks, and I apologize that we had to cut it a little short.
Thank you, appreciate y'all.
So it doesn't look like there are any questions, but thanks to Juanita and Suzanne for this enlightening presentation, and to all of you for attending. Please join us for our final session, which begins at 3:05. Take care, everyone.